He thought he was untouchable. The neon lights of Washington blurred against the rain-slick streets below. Televisions flickered in empty apartments, in bustling cafes, in hotel suites where the powerful thought themselves alone. But no one was truly alone tonight. Not with the world watching. Yesterday, something happened no one saw coming. A file, a leak, a whisper, call it what you want, tore through the corridors of power like a silent explosion. It landed in the lap of a network that thrives on certainty, that thrives on control. And suddenly, everything felt unsteady. The debate began like any other. Calm smiles. Polished notes. Teleprompters scrolling predictably. Then the first name appeared on air. One name. One sentence that changed the room. The camera lingered. The microphones caught the subtle hitch in the anchor's breath. A politician's hand trembled over a cue card. And the audience at home leaned in. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight? No one said a word for a moment, and yet the air vibrated with questions. The questions were louder than any shouting. Who knew what? Who covered what up? How deep did it go? And more importantly, who would fall first? Outside, the city never slept. Neon lights hummed over streets slick with rain. Somewhere, a taxi driver rolled past a government building and didn't even notice the subtle flicker of panic inside. Somewhere else, a journalist typed frantically, fingers flying over keys, eyes scanning lines that could get her silenced before morning. The hum of life continued, and yet, underneath, the pulse of Washington shifted. No one wanted to speak it aloud, but the weight of it pressed into the lungs of everyone who saw the files. Epstein. Names. Dates. Connections. Transactions. And yet, it was more than the data. It was the implication. The truth that whispered, the rules were different for some. Power had a code that no one else could read. A camera cut to the anchor, a practiced smile frozen mid-pitch. Ladies and gentlemen, breaking news, but no words could capture the feeling in the room. The city outside kept blinking. The rain kept falling. But inside those studio walls, history was being recorded live. And you could feel it in the silence between breaths. The dreamer sat in the back row, notebook open. A young idealist who thought reporting was about facts, not chessboards of manipulation. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He didn't even remember how he got there. He only knew one thing: tonight, someone would have to answer. Someone always does. And if not, the world itself would answer for them. The first guest on the debate panel cleared her throat. The camera cut closer. Her eyes flicked to the papers in front of her, and her lips tightened. She had memorized lines for weeks. Talking points, prepared statements, the scripts that were supposed to keep chaos at bay. But tonight, those scripts were useless. Tonight, the leak wasn't a story. It was a revelation. And the revelation had teeth. At first, the debate seemed normal. Questions floated like carefully tossed pebbles across calm water. But soon, the undercurrent rose. The machine, that invisible structure of influence and power, began to show cracks. Every sentence weighed heavy. Every sidestep was measured. Every hesitation was caught on a screen somewhere, analyzed by tens of thousands. And then, one word slipped, unguarded, accidental, human. And that word turned the tide. A heartbeat later, the city seemed quieter. The streets, the cafes, the apartments, all held their breath. And in that pause, every American could feel it. The invisible structures of power, the silent hands shaping destiny, the decisions made in shadow, all were suddenly illuminated. And in the echo of that illumination, one truth was clear: the world had changed. Not tomorrow. Not next week. But tonight. Here. Now. And that was the night Washington quietly trembled. He wasn't born powerful. Not in the gleaming towers. Not in the rooms where decisions were whispered. Not in the photographs that would one day circulate, smiling faces in perfect lighting. He was shaped, like all of them, by the system. The machine. By the weight of expectation and the hunger for survival in a city that rewards ambition and punishes hesitation. The dreamer, still scribbling in his notebook, had a life outside the glow of studio lights. A small apartment, books stacked in uneven towers, a record player that hummed soft jazz. He had grown up thinking fairness was something real, a law, a promise, a social contract. But the city had taught him otherwise. The lessons were subtle. A look, a pause, an opportunity offered and then quietly withdrawn. And over time, he learned to read between the lines. To see the architecture beneath the speeches. To feel the pulse of the machine. He wasn't naive. He was curious. And curiosity is dangerous in Washington. Across the marble corridors, the machine whispered in circuits, cables, and human veins. Connections that no one else could trace. Names that carried weight like gold bars in a vault. Deals that moved in shadows, invisible to the public eye. He watched it all. Absorbed it. And somewhere along the way, he realized that knowledge isn't the same as power. Understanding the game does not mean you can play it, not yet. The machine does not forgive. The machine does not pause. And yet, it cannot hide from the cracks it makes. Behind the studio, monitors showed patterns of whispers. Social media exploded with fragments of conversation. Clips looped endlessly. The public watched, dissected, debated. And the anchors? They couldn't stop it. The politicians? They were already scrambling. The dreamer scribbled one word repeatedly in his notebook: accountability. And then came the silence. A pause that was too long for the human ear, too loaded for the broadcast. In that quiet, you could almost hear the city breathing, confused, tense, aware. You could feel the system teetering on the edge of something it could not control. The lights on set flickered. Cameras rolled. Microphones hummed. And the viewers at home, they leaned closer. Some whispered to themselves. Some laughed nervously. Some stared, unable to look away. History was being written, one word at a time. And the echo would not fade. Somewhere else, in a private office, the watchman sat quietly. He had seen this before. He had predicted it, warned about it. But predicting is not controlling. And tonight, control was slipping through fingers like sand. He lit a cigarette, inhaled slowly, and exhaled a plume of smoke into the dim light. So it begins, he muttered. And he meant it. Not just the debate. Not just the leak. The unraveling of something larger, older, and far more dangerous. The screen cut to black briefly before returning to the anchor. Her voice shook, barely, as she summarized what the audience already knew: the files were real. Connections were made. Names that no one had dared speak aloud now hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And the question remained, for everyone watching, for everyone breathing: what happens next? And that's when everything changed. He met her, the watcher. Not a politician. Not a journalist. Not a celebrity. Someone who existed in a space between observation and influence. Someone who had seen too much, too early, and had learned to move quietly, strategically, like a shadow. She didn't speak loudly, but when she did, people listened. He felt it the first time she entered the room, the hum of authority without arrogance. The calm certainty of someone who had survived storms the rest of the world didn't even know existed. She leaned close once, just for a moment, and said, "Power isn't given. It's recognized. And it's taken, if you're willing to pay the cost." He nodded, pretending to understand. But the truth didn't sink in immediately. It would take months, years, for the weight of her words to anchor in his mind. And while he learned, the world kept spinning. The news cycles churned, campaigns advanced, deals closed. The city moved with predictable rhythm, as though nothing had shifted. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Small anomalies, an email that vanished, a name that didn't belong, a file that was never supposed to be discovered. Patterns emerged. The machine was not perfect. Far from it. The files that would later ignite the debate weren't the spark themselves. They were the evidence of something older, larger, systemic. He traced them, quietly, obsessively. Each name, each date, each connection told a story, not just of corruption, but of human frailty, of ambition unchecked, of morality surrendered. And yet, it was also a story of resilience. Of those few who dared to witness, who dared to remember. The dreamer began to see patterns in people, too. The ambitious politician, so polished on air, trembled in private. The celebrity with perfect smiles carried shadows he couldn't name. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the city, ordinary citizens lived their lives unaware that these patterns affected them, like tides pulling under the shore, unseen but inevitable. He realized something crucial: the human element was the real leverage. Not the money. Not the titles. Not the files themselves. But the fear, ambition, desire, and loyalty that tethered each participant to the system. Understanding that, truly understanding it, was dangerous knowledge. Sometimes, he would catch a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface and almost not recognize the man who had started this journey. Once naive, once idealistic, now part observer, part participant. He understood compromise not as a failure but as survival. He saw the contradictions in himself, the desire to expose truth, the need to survive, the fear of becoming complicit. And in that duality, he found humanity. The watcher, sensing his struggle, said nothing. She only handed him a file once, carefully, deliberately. No explanation. Just the weight of it, cold and tangible, like a challenge. "Learn from this," she said, and left. It was not a gift. It was a reckoning. For hours, he pored over the pages. Names, dates, meetings. Some mundane, some explosive. Connections he had only suspected now revealed in stark relief. And he felt it, that shiver of knowing. That mix of awe, fear, and sorrow. The files weren't just a record of events. They were a mirror. A reflection of power, ambition, weakness, and the quiet moral compromises that made all of it possible. Somewhere in that night, the dreamer understood something essential: the system was human. It was not flawless. It did not bend toward justice automatically. It bent toward those who understood it, those who could navigate its invisible currents. Those who could endure its storms. He put the file down, leaned back in his chair, and realized he was no longer just a witness. He was a participant. Not in the way the powerful imagined, with status or influence. But in the moral landscape, the knowledge of truth, the burden of awareness, and the choice of action. And for the first time, he understood the cost. Outside, the rain fell heavier, tapping the windows in a rhythm that seemed to echo the city's heartbeat. The lights of Washington blurred in the wet night. Somewhere, a siren wailed, a distant sound, meaningless to most, urgent to him. A reminder that life goes on. That the world waits for no one. That even truths, when revealed, must navigate the tide of human inertia. And in that quiet reflection, he made a promise. Not to fame. Not to recognition. Not even to justice, not yet. But to clarity. To seeing. To naming. To understanding. And maybe, someday, to acting. Because the system would not change itself. People change. People, human, flawed, beautiful, afraid, change systems. And that's when everything changed. The city outside continued. Rain gleamed on asphalt. Neon flickered. The hum of life persisted. But inside the dreamer's small apartment, in that quiet, the first seeds of reckoning were planted. He could feel them growing. He picked up his pen again, and the words came, fast, unfiltered, alive. Not just notes. Not just facts. But reflection, observation, human truth. The kind that reaches across screens, across streets, across minds. The kind that forces people to feel the weight of what's real. And in that act, he found the spark. Not of heroism. Not of fame. But of purpose. A purpose that would soon ripple far beyond him. Far beyond the files. Far beyond the debate that had just begun to tremble in public view. Sometimes the loudest silence is the one inside you. At first, it looked like progress. The cameras rolled. The debate continued. Polished smiles, rehearsed questions, the predictable rhythm of television that gives the illusion of control. But beneath the bright lights and scripted rhetoric, the room was quietly unraveling. The machine had noticed. It moves in whispers. In a glance. In a pause too long to be accidental. And suddenly, everyone who thought themselves untouchable felt it, the subtle pressure, the invisible hand adjusting the pieces on a board they didn't realize they were part of. The files had changed everything, even before they were fully understood. The dreamer watched it happen, silently. He noticed the micro-expressions, the politician who nodded a fraction too quickly, the anchor whose smile tightened just slightly, the aide who swallowed and looked away. He had studied people long enough to know these signs. Cracks were appearing. And Washington, the city that always hides its fractures beneath marble and neon, was beginning to bleed. At first, the audience didn't see it. They only saw the words on the screen. But the words were misdirection. The tension existed in the spaces between them. The silence before a response. The hesitation in a tone that was meant to be confident. The way a hand trembled over a document that was supposed to give the illusion of certainty. And the questions started coming. Not scripted, not rehearsed. Real questions. Dangerous questions. From the panel, from the moderators, from the journalists who smelled the truth like blood in water. Names were mentioned. Connections implied. Dates, transactions, meetings, all under scrutiny. The machine fought back. From someone he trusted. Someone who had smiled beside him in rallies, dinners, and private offices. Someone who had promised loyalty. The words were simple. Too simple. They're already talking. There's nothing left to stop it. And with that, the calm veneer shattered. He moved back to the table. The men and women surrounding him had become shadows of themselves. Eyes darting. Hands fidgeting. All waiting for a command that might not exist. Because the problem wasn't just the story anymore. It was the truth behind it. The details were staggering. Flight logs that couldn't be explained. Connections that seemed invisible until they were undeniable. Videos and photographs archived like time bombs. And everyone knew the clock was ticking. He remembered the first time he understood fear like this. Not the fear of losing an election. Not the fear of a bad deal. Not the fear of ridicule. Real fear. The kind that comes when your choices ripple beyond control. When every decision might haunt you. When the people you've built your empire with could become instruments of your downfall. This was that fear. The tension wasn't just in the room. It had entered his body. A low hum in the chest. A restlessness that made him pace. 1,000 scenarios playing out in rapid succession. What if the narrative slipped? What if the media, or worse, the law, framed him before he could act? What if the system he thought he controlled now controlled him? He leaned over the table, hands flat, feeling the weight of history pressing down. You tell me what we know, he said. And tell me what they don't. The team shifted uncomfortably. One by one, they relayed facts. Then speculation. Then panic disguised as analysis. But nothing was reassuring. Outside, the city hummed like always. Above, traffic lights blinked in indifferent rhythm. Inside, time had a different pulse. Faster. Sharper. Each second a reminder that decisions mattered more than ever, because consequences waited immediately. Paranoia settled like smoke. Who was honest? Who was hiding something? Who was quietly watching, waiting for him to slip? Even his allies, those he had trusted for decades, now felt like threats. A simple nod. A delayed answer. A glance at a screen. Each gesture could be interpreted as betrayal. He sat down finally. Fingers interlaced. Eyes narrowing. The weight of every decision pressing into his chest like steel bands. You can't negotiate with ghosts, he said quietly. And some ghosts remember everything. It wasn't just Epstein. It wasn't just the evidence. It was every choice he had ever made. Every alliance, every misstep, every secret he had tried to bury. And the realization hit him. Some of the enemies weren't outside. They were inside. The storm outside the room intensified, wind rattling glass, distant sirens wailing. It mirrored the storm inside him. Inside the team. Inside the walls of a system built on secrecy, loyalty, and fear. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, doubt. Not about power. Not about influence. Not even about survival. The machine tried again. Quietly, invisibly, subtly. A reassignment here. A distraction there. An urgent memo. A phone call to someone who matters. And for a moment, it seemed to hold. The cracks softened, the surface tension stabilized. But only for a moment. Because tension, once awakened, does not rest. The human element, fear, ambition, pride, curiosity, cannot be contained. It bubbles to the surface. It infects every interaction. Every glance, every word, every pause becomes meaningful. And the system, no matter how vast, no matter how refined, bends in response. The dreamer felt exhaustion creep in. Not just physical, but moral. The weight of observing, the weight of knowing, the weight of anticipating collapse. The files had revealed the skeleton of the machine. The debate revealed its muscle, its motion, its instinct. And the public, whether they knew it consciously or not, felt it too. Every decision now carried consequence. Every word now carried weight. Every human in the room, in the studio, on the phone, or at home watching, was participating in a fragile experiment. Could truth survive when the system fights to suppress it? And the answer was, uncertain. Because tension, real tension, has no easy resolution. Outside, the rain persisted. Streets glistened. Neon lights hummed. Somewhere, a car alarm sounded briefly, inconsequential in the grand scale, yet echoing the unease inside every human being paying attention. Washington had always been a city of appearances. Tonight, those appearances were cracking. And for those watching closely, the fractures were impossible to ignore. The dreamer realized something frightening: the debate, the leak, the public spectacle, all of it had been anticipated. Not in detail, but in principle. The machine could absorb shocks. Deflect scrutiny. Redirect outrage. And yet, it had failed this time. Not completely, but enough to reveal its skeleton. He thought back to the files. Connections, yes. Names, yes. But also conversations, memos, hints of transactions that never appeared on a ledger. And that's when he understood the full scope. The machine wasn't just about hiding wrongdoing. It was about shaping reality. About determining which truths mattered, which would be amplified, and which would disappear quietly into archives no one would ever see. What looked like freedom was dependency, he whispered to himself, realizing the irony. Everyone believed they were acting independently. Anchors, politicians, journalists, even the audience, all were players on a stage, convinced they were free, when in fact the stage itself dictated every move. He sat back, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the room. The anchor smiled again, now more carefully. A politician shifted in his seat. The audience at home, unaware, continued scrolling, reading, reacting. But the underlying reality, the scaffolding of control, had been exposed. Just a little. Just enough. And that was dangerous. Because once the curtain lifts, even a fraction, the illusion can't be fully restored. The dreamer began connecting threads. He saw how favors had been exchanged. How influence traveled quietly, invisibly, like a virus spreading without notice. How reputations could be crafted and destroyed at will. And how the files, mundane to most, contained the map of the system itself. He turned the pages slowly, deliberately. Each entry revealed more than just events. It revealed motives. Weaknesses. Ambition and fear intertwined. And he realized that what seemed like chaos on the surface was actually a mechanism, a system designed to test loyalty, to measure compliance, to calibrate reactions. Somewhere in the corridors, someone noticed the discrepancy. A name that shouldn't have been on a document. A meeting that never happened. A date that didn't align. And for the first time, the machine responded in panic. Not outwardly, not visibly. But in the micro-movements, a hurried call, a door closed abruptly, a glance exchanged that spoke volumes. The dreamer smiled faintly. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. But recognition. He had seen the gears turning. He had seen the engine of control exposed. And he knew now, in a way he hadn't before, how fragile it truly was. He remembered the Watcher's words, power isn't given. It's recognized. And it's taken, if you're willing to pay the cost. Now he understood. Not just recognition. But awareness. And the cost of that awareness was relentless. Because the machine doesn't forgive those who know its mechanics. Not easily. Not quietly. Not without consequence. He looked up as the debate returned from commercial. The anchor spoke, measured, careful. The panelists exchanged lines of practiced civility. And yet, underneath, the tension was visible to anyone watching closely. Every glance, every hesitation, every micro-expression was loaded with the weight of the newly revealed truth. The files had done more than expose names. They had illuminated the system itself. And the audience, millions of eyes glued to screens, scrolling, commenting, sharing, were now participants in a drama they hadn't chosen but could not escape. The dreamer realized something else: the files were not the revolution. They were the mirror. They reflected the machine, its power, its weakness, its humanity, and the choices that anyone might make when confronted with truth. Somewhere else, in an office bathed in the glow of a single lamp, the Watcher observed the flow of information. She noted the reactions, the hesitations, the subtle shifts in posture. She didn't intervene. She didn't need to. Awareness itself was enough. Awareness would ripple. Awareness would act. And in that silence, the dreamer felt a strange calm. Not because the machine was defeated. Not because justice was achieved. But because truth, even partially revealed, had the power to awaken. To illuminate. To remind people that the world is not just what it appears to be. And then the full weight hit him. The realization that knowledge carries responsibility. That seeing the system is only the beginning. That understanding it means navigating its dangers carefully, because the machine does not tolerate exposure lightly. And yet, he could not turn away. He would not. The files lay before him, a chaotic map of power, ambition, and human frailty. He traced lines, connected nodes, saw the architecture of influence with new clarity. And he understood, the debate was only the surface. The machine's mechanics were below. And once exposed, they could not be unseen. What looked like freedom was dependency. What looked like chaos was choreography. What looked like silence was the hum of control. And the question lingered, heavier than ever, what would he do with this knowledge? The city outside continued, oblivious. Rain pattered on pavement, neon reflected in puddles, a distant siren wailed. Inside, the hum of electricity, cameras, and anxious hearts filled the studio. Washington had been revealed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to fracture illusions. And in that moment, the dreamer felt the first stirrings of action. Not yet public, not yet declared. But inevitable. Because once you see the gears, you cannot pretend they are not there. The files were more than evidence. They were instruction. A blueprint. A warning. And if he chose to follow it, the world would never be the same. And for the first time, he understood the scale of what he faced. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. The rain outside hammered harder now. Washington glistened like a city of mirrors, reflecting neon, light, and shadow. Inside the studio, chaos had become rhythm. The debate continued, but it was no longer about points or policy. It was about survival, perception, truth, the raw human stakes hidden beneath polished words. The dreamer felt it in his chest, a storm he could not escape. Not in the files. Not in the debate. Not in the reflection of himself staring back from the dark glass of the studio windows. The weight of knowing, the cost of awareness, the responsibility of choice, it pressed down until breath became deliberate, deliberate until thought slowed to its edge. Somewhere behind the cameras, the watcher remained silent. She did not need to speak. The air was charged enough that silence became language. Every glance, every movement, every pause carried meaning. And the dreamer understood, they were no longer players on a stage. They were witnesses, participants in a crucible, forced to confront the moral architecture of power itself. He thought about the people whose names were in the files. Some had been predators. Some enablers. Some oblivious, caught in networks far beyond their comprehension. And he realized, the storm wasn't outside. The storm was inside every human heart that had touched the system, and inside every human heart forced to reckon with its consequences. The first crack became impossible to ignore. A politician snapped mid-sentence. Words barreled out too quickly, too sharply, spilling truth by accident. The anchor froze, momentarily unprepared, as if the human element had intruded where control had once reigned. The audience leaned forward, felt it in their own pulse. The dreamer scribbled furiously, "Chaos is the only honest reaction." The debate spiraled. Not in spectacle, but in raw human exposure. Fear, ambition, guilt, pride, every human emotion amplified, not by sound or spectacle, but by the pressure of moral weight. Every participant was being observed, every word recorded, every hesitation dissected. The machine strained, struggling to maintain the facade of order. And yet, the cracks revealed something beautiful. Humanity. Not heroism. Not victory. Not villainy. Humanity. The frailty, the fear, the courage hiding in hesitation, the spark of conscience igniting in the heat of exposure. For a moment, the dreamer forgot himself. He simply watched. Observed. Felt. And realized, the system, complex, calculated, ruthless, could not entirely suppress the raw truth of being human. Then came the explosion. A live question from a journalist who had refused scripts, refused control. One simple question, sharp as a blade. The panelists froze. The anchors blinked. The public leaned in closer. And the first truth escaped fully into the air. Names, actions, omissions, all revealed in stark, undeniable clarity. The dreamer's hands trembled. Not from fear. Not from adrenaline. But from recognition. He had studied these patterns for months. He had traced the threads, mapped the nodes, seen the architecture. And yet, nothing could prepare him for the human magnitude of seeing it unravel in real time. Because the storm is never just about what is revealed. It is about what people choose to do with revelation. It is about conscience, fear, and human imperfection. The dreamer felt exhaustion now. Not physical. Moral exhaustion. The sense that the weight of knowing and witnessing could crush a person. And yet, he couldn't turn away. He couldn't. He had seen the machine. He had traced the threads. He had observed humanity exposed in its rawest form. And he knew that turning away would be complicity. The debate continued, cascading in waves of revelation and reaction. Words collided with facts. Silence collided with screams. Truth collided with perception. And the audience, caught in the spectacle, felt it all. They didn't fully understand what they were witnessing, but they felt its gravity. They felt the storm. He wrote one last line in his notebook before the feed went to commercial, and when the world falls, it shows who you really are. And in that pause, the storm fully arrived. The systems built to contain chaos faltered. Human frailty showed its sharp edges. The files, once a map of control, became instruments of disruption. And Washington, the city that thrives on certainty, trembled under the weight of exposure. The dreamer understood it clearly now: the machine, for all its power, could not suppress human truth indefinitely. Morality, curiosity, courage, they slipped through the cracks, unstoppable, unpredictable. And once the storm had been stirred, the aftermath would demand reckoning. Outside, rain pounded. Lightning illuminated the reflective streets. Neon flickered against puddles. Somewhere, far below, a city oblivious to the human tension unfolding in its heart continued. But inside the studio, the storm was total. Every human present felt it. Every word carried it. Every silence held it. The machine reacted. Subtle, almost invisible countermeasures, whispered instructions, hurried phone calls, a pause in the broadcast, an attempt to redirect perception. But once truth escapes into the air, it cannot be recaptured. It moves faster than power can react, slipping between control, between influence, between the structures built to contain it. The dreamer realized the stakes. If the files were released in full, if the truth was amplified, the machine could adapt. It always could. But in this moment, raw exposure had the power to disrupt. To awaken. To make people feel the weight of what had been hidden. He looked around. The anchor's voice trembled, but she kept speaking. The panelists shifted in their chairs. Micro-expressions betrayed the inner panic that polished statements could not hide. The audience, millions strong, collectively sensed the fracture. And for a heartbeat, Washington held its breath. The storm moved inward. He thought about morality, not as an abstract concept, not as law or ideology, but as action. As choice. The choice to speak, to act, to witness, to refuse complicity. And he felt the enormity of it. The files were more than evidence. They were a mirror. And the mirror reflected not just the machine, but every human tethered to it. The dreamer understood the cost. Not just of knowing. Not just of exposure. But of responsibility. Knowledge obligates action. Awareness demands courage. And courage carries risk, the risk of being destroyed, ignored, vilified, or worse. Somewhere else, the watcher lit a cigarette, inhaled slowly, exhaled deliberately. She had seen this storm before. She had lived it, navigated it, survived it. And yet, even she felt the tension. And then, silence spoke louder. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It isn't written in law. It isn't printed on paper. It isn't stored in vaults or whispered in corridors of power. It's passed down, quietly, one brave choice at a time. And tonight, somewhere in the chaos of revelation, that truth hovered like smoke through the studio. The debate had ended, or at least it had paused. The anchors offered the semblance of closure. Panelists shuffled their notes, smiled politely, and left. Cameras blinked off. The public, millions strong, began to process what they had seen, fragments of truth, flashes of vulnerability, hints of corruption. And somewhere in that million-strong audience, hearts beat a little faster, questions formed, and awareness rippled. The dreamer sat in the empty studio, the files spread around him like a chaotic constellation. He had traced the connections. He had seen the architecture of the machine. He had felt the storm, measured the cracks, observed the tremors in human behavior. And now he could breathe. Not fully relieved. Not fully safe. But grounded in the understanding that knowledge, even partial, even dangerous, has the power to illuminate. He picked up a pen and wrote slowly, "Freedom is the courage to see clearly. To act accordingly. To witness without surrender." The watcher appeared quietly, almost as if she had always been part of the shadows. She didn't speak immediately. She simply stood, observing, the faintest smile on her lips. Then she said, "It's not about victory. Not yet. It's about recognition. And sometimes, recognition is enough to start change." He nodded. He understood. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not applause, simply clarity. The machine would continue to operate, and the city would go on, but within the fracture, the truth had been seen. And that seed, fragile, small, but undeniable, could grow. Outside, Washington breathed. The streets reflected the neon and the rain. Life continued. The chaos of normality carried on. And yet, beneath it, something had shifted. The balance had altered. The human awareness of power, corruption, and choice had been awakened. The dreamer closed his notebook. The files remained, heavy with implication, but the moment of calm had arrived. Reflection was a choice as vital as action. Understanding was as important as exposure. And in that quiet, he allowed himself to feel the subtle pulse of hope. Hope, not naive, not blind, but deliberate. Hope in the small acts of recognition, in the courage to question, in the willingness to see what is hidden. Hope in the human capacity to learn, adapt, and, sometimes, resist the weight of the system. He walked to the window, watched the rain streak down glass, and felt the city pulse beneath him. The streets gleamed with a life oblivious to the revelation, yet it would carry the echoes. Patterns would change slowly. Conversations would shift subtly. Decisions would be made differently. And all of it traced back to moments like this, quiet, reflective, deliberate. The watcher's voice broke the silence. Every revelation carries responsibility. Every truth carries weight. You'll have to choose what to do with it. And he understood. It was not enough to see. It was not enough to know. Action, small, deliberate, human action, would follow. And that action, multiplied across countless moments and countless people, could ripple farther than the machine ever intended. He thought of the people in the debate. The anchors, the panelists, the journalists. Not as villains or heroes, but as humans navigating a complex moral landscape. Each had the opportunity to bend or break. Each had the chance to see or ignore. And each, in their choices, contributed to the shape of the world that would emerge from this storm. He felt the quiet of reflection settle over him. Not complacency. Not resignation. Just clarity. The storm had passed, or at least had become something quieter, something internalized. The files still hummed with potential. The machine still turned. The city still slept in neon and rain. But inside him, a light had been lit. A light that illuminated the fragility and the resilience of humanity. He spoke softly, almost to himself, "So when your moment comes, what will you stand for?" The words hung in the air. Not a question with one answer, but a challenge to anyone listening, anyone witnessing, anyone aware. Choice is the currency of freedom. Awareness is the beginning of responsibility. And courage determines what survives. Outside, the rain began to ease. Puddles reflected fractured light, imperfect but beautiful. The city exhaled. Somewhere, a taxi honked. Somewhere, a pedestrian laughed. Life went on. And yet, beneath it, the pulse of awareness persisted. The echo of revelation had been planted. He gathered the files, stacked them carefully. Not to hide, not to hoard, but to respect. Knowledge is dangerous. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is responsibility. And tonight, he had glimpsed all three in their rawest form. The watcher's presence lingered, silent now. A quiet acknowledgement of understanding, of connection, of shared responsibility. She did not need to speak. The dreamer already knew. And in that knowledge, there was peace. Not triumph. Not certainty. But peace. And as he stepped away from the window, letting the weight of the moment settle, he whispered one final thought, more to the world than to himself. If this story made you think, share it. Because truth survives only when it's told. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. Neon lights faded against the gray of morning. Puddles reflected a washed-out sky. The streets carried the debris of last night's storm, not just rain, but the invisible remnants of tension that had rippled through every office, apartment, newsroom, and home. Washington had slept, but it hadn't healed. Not completely. The files were out. Or at least fragments were. Clips from the debate had gone viral overnight. Social media burned with discussion. Newsrooms spun into overdrive. Every broadcast, every post, every headline carried the echoes of yesterday's revelation. And somewhere, deep inside the city, the machine trembled. The dreamer walked through the streets, notebook tucked under his arm. The air smelled like wet asphalt and coffee. He observed quietly. People walking to work, scrolling on their phones, unaware that their reality had subtly shifted. Yet the patterns were already changing, conversations whispered on stoops, debates in cafes, heated arguments on subway platforms. The truth had escaped into the bloodstream of the city. And now, it flowed freely. He remembered the storm, the tension, the chaos, the moral weight pressing on every human in the studio. And he understood something vital: revelation alone does not guarantee change. People must choose to act. And the first act is always awareness. Across town, politicians convened in private offices, emails buzzing, advisors muttering. Some panicked. Some calculated. Some tried to spin the narrative back under control. But the effort felt hollow. The public had already glimpsed the skeleton of the machine. And once skeletons are seen, they can't be hidden again. The dreamer observed quietly, scribbling another line in his notebook: the world shifts first in thought, then in action. In cafes, reporters debated the implications of what they had seen. Some feared reprisal. Some feared inaction. And yet, beneath their fear, there was a spark, the spark of responsibility. Witnessing truth, they realized, carries weight. And weight, once felt, can compel movement. The machine was still turning. Slowly, methodically, trying to maintain order. But the gears had been exposed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to fracture its seamless appearance. And fractures, once present, are paths through which change flows. The dreamer remembered the faces from the debate. Anchors, politicians, panelists, all caught in the tension between appearance and reality. Some would act with integrity. Some would exploit chaos. Some would hide and hope the storm passed. And that uncertainty, that human unpredictability, was both terrifying and beautiful. He walked past the Capitol, its marble cold and indifferent. The streets hummed with the rhythm of a city oblivious to the subtle seismic shifts beneath. And yet, those who had witnessed the storm knew the landscape had altered. The rules of perception had been tested, the illusions fractured, and the human element revealed. Somewhere, the watcher observed from a quiet cafe. She noted the patterns forming in real time. Tweets, posts, articles, the echo of last night's revelation spreading, shaping thought, altering conversation. She sipped her coffee and allowed herself a small smile. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but recognition. Awareness had been planted. Change, subtle but inevitable, would follow. The dreamer paused at a crosswalk, watching people move past. He realized the aftermath wasn't just in headlines or debates. It was in the subtle, human moments, the quiet acknowledgement that reality had shifted, even if only slightly. Conversations would be different. Decisions would be measured. Awareness had entered the bloodstream of the city. And once in the bloodstream, it is hard to remove. The files remained with him, heavy yet necessary. Not evidence for leverage. Not tools for power. But instruments of clarity. Instruments that illuminated the system, the people, and the moral architecture that underpins human decisions. And in that illumination, there was choice. Choice that would ripple, in small ways and large, through the city, the nation, and perhaps the world. He thought of the politicians trying to regain control. The machine attempting to restore order. The anchors and journalists recalibrating for the next broadcast. And he understood something crucial: none of it mattered in isolation. What mattered was human engagement, people recognizing, questioning, reflecting, and acting. Without that, even the clearest revelations are like leaves swept in the wind, beautiful but ephemeral. The dreamer found himself back at his apartment as evening approached. He spread the files across his desk once more. Not to obsess. Not to tremble at the weight. But to remind himself of the responsibility that awareness brings. Knowledge without action is incomplete. Understanding without courage is hollow. And he knew, even in the quiet, in the stillness, that action would come. Outside, the neon lights returned. The rain had softened to a drizzle, reflecting in puddles like scattered stars on asphalt. Washington's pulse resumed its familiar rhythm, but beneath it, something different beat. Awareness had entered the flow of life. Humanity had seen the machine's skeleton. And that knowledge, carried quietly in millions of hearts and minds, could never be erased. The watcher's voice echoed in his memory: every revelation carries responsibility. Every truth carries weight. You'll have to choose what to do with it. He whispered back to himself, and I will. In the aftermath, the storm had not ended. The city, the people, the system, all were in flux. But something essential had shifted. Human awareness, moral recognition, and the courage to witness had been ignited. And the dreamer understood, this was only the beginning. The files had changed everything, not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly, indelibly. Every interaction, every decision, every conversation carried the echo of last night. And for the first time, the dreamer felt the weight of potential, the weight of knowing that truth, once seen, can ripple farther than power ever anticipates. Sometimes, change begins in silence. Washington awoke to fragments of revelation seeping into every corner. Headlines screamed. Social media erupted. Conversations in offices, cafes, and homes carried the weight of the files. The debate had been broadcast, dissected, and dissected again, each iteration amplifying the tremors that had begun in the studio. And the machine, that vast, invisible web of influence, had no choice but to respond. Not all of it was visible. Not all of it could be controlled. The consequences, subtle and sprawling, moved like shadows, touching offices, boardrooms, and corridors of power. Some people panicked. Some calculated. Some disappeared into the background, hoping the storm would pass. Others embraced it, realizing the fragility of the system offered opportunity, or perhaps, clarity. The dreamer observed quietly, walking along streets slick with rain from the night before. He passed office towers, their lights flickering against wet glass. Inside, deals were reconsidered. Meetings were rescheduled. Messages deleted. Emails rewritten. Every node in the web of power was feeling pressure, reacting instinctively, unconsciously, in ways the public would never see. And yet the pattern was clear. Exposure, once it begins, cannot be undone. He remembered the faces from the debate, the anchor, the panelists, the politicians. They had performed under pressure, but now the weight of consequence stretched behind them. Each decision, each slip, each hesitation had multiplied in impact. The public had begun to see the cracks, and the cracks were changing behavior, subtly but irreversibly. Somewhere in a private office, a senator argued fiercely with aides. "We need to contain this narrative," he barked, slamming a fist on the polished desk. The aides nodded, tense, typing, whispering into phones. But they knew. They knew the exposure was irreversible. The truth had entered the bloodstream of the nation. And the nation, not the machine, now dictated part of the outcome. The dreamer scribbled another line in his notebook: "Control is an illusion once the human mind awakens." Outside, citizens debated in quiet and loud ways alike. Coffee shops became micro-laboratories of analysis. Conversations in hallways, at bus stops, in living rooms, examined every fragment of the files, every clip from the debate. People argued, speculated, and, slowly, insidiously, began questioning not just the system, but their own assumptions. Awareness had multiplied, spiraling outward like ripples in water. The machine, sensing its grip loosening, adapted. Strategic leaks, misdirections, polished statements, orchestrated appearances. Every move a calculated response. But the dreamer noticed the subtle fatigue, the hum of control fraying at the edges. Systems designed to suppress perception couldn't fully suppress human curiosity. They could redirect it, delay it, even distort it, but not erase it. And that was the real consequence. Not panic. Not scandal. Not headlines. But human observation. Human reflection. Human choice. The dreamer walked through a park, puddles reflecting streetlights and neon. Children splashed in shallow water. A dog barked. Life moved forward, unaware of the storm's moral weight, yet intrinsically shaped by it. And he realized something crucial: consequences are rarely immediate. They grow, subtle as seeds, until they take root and shape the world without anyone noticing. Back at his apartment, he laid the files on the table. The weight of them was physical, but also moral. Each name, each connection, each hidden truth was a reminder of what humans are capable of, good, bad, and everything in between. And each person exposed, each decision unmasked, rippled outward into the consequences that Washington, and perhaps the country, would now face. He thought of the watcher. She had warned him, silently, that knowledge carries responsibility. The files, he realized, were both sword and shield. They could protect truth or expose it. They could illuminate or destroy. And the human element, courage, fear, ambition, conscience, determined which path would dominate. Somewhere, in a newsroom, a journalist stared at a screen, rereading a document, weighing the implications. The city hummed outside, indifferent to the moral deliberations inside. And yet, the journalist, like the dreamer, was now a node in the chain of consequence. Each action, each choice, carried weight beyond what could be measured. He looked at the city skyline, rain dripping from edges of glass towers. The machine continued its work, calculating, maneuvering, adjusting. But it could no longer act with perfect invisibility. The cracks, once small and hidden, had widened. And the consequences, subtle at first, were now unavoidable. The dreamer wrote slowly, every action, every exposure, multiplies in ways the system cannot anticipate. Every truth has a trajectory. In a private corridor, a young aide whispered to an older advisor, "Do you think the files will destroy them?" The advisor shook his head slowly. "No. They'll expose them. And exposure changes everything. Some will adapt. Some will crumble. Some will be remembered differently than they imagined." And that was the reality of consequences, unpredictable, human, irrevocable. Across town, politicians tried to regain control through statements and speeches. They attempted to rewrite narrative arcs, but the public had already observed. The cracks had been seen. The awareness was irreversible. And the dreamer understood that consequences, unlike fear or intimidation, are not something you can manage entirely. They are something you endure, respond to, and learn from, if you are human enough to do so. He walked back to his apartment, the city quiet now under early morning light. The files lay before him, luminous with implication. The human, moral, and systemic consequences of last night's revelations were only beginning. He could feel them spreading outward like tremors after an earthquake. Some immediate, some delayed, some subtle, others monumental. And in that realization, he saw the delicate balance of power, awareness, and choice. He understood that the machine would persist, always adapting, always calculating. But human action, born of awareness and moral confrontation, would always introduce uncertainty, and that uncertainty was the seed of change. He picked up a pen, wrote one last line for the moment: consequences are the echo of truth, traveling farther than power ever intended. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The city gleamed, wet streets reflecting fractured light. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere, a protest sign would be made. Somewhere, a conversation would change trajectory. And somewhere, the dreamer knew, seeds of moral reckoning had been planted. Because consequences are never contained. They move. They multiply. They awaken. And tonight, Washington, the city of appearances, of power, of invisible machinery, had been awakened. The city moved around him, oblivious to the moral tremors shaking the hearts of those who had witnessed. Washington was always in motion, streets humming, lights flickering, elevators rising and falling, voices blending into a constant rhythm. And yet, beneath it, a subtle pulse persisted. The pulse of reflection, of human reckoning, of truth finding its way into consciousness. The dreamer sat alone, notebook open, pen poised but motionless. He thought about the storm, the files, the debate, the machine. He thought about every glance, every hesitation, every choice he had observed. And he realized that the greatest consequence wasn't political collapse, nor scandal, nor media frenzy. It was human awareness. The files were just paper. The debate was just performance. The machine was just architecture. What mattered, what would last, was how humans responded. How they chose to act when confronted with moral clarity. How they carried responsibility, recognized accountability, and wrestled with truth. He remembered the faces, the anchor, poised yet trembling, the panelist, faltering yet human, the journalist, relentless yet wary. Each had been forced into the light of revelation, each had glimpsed themselves reflected in a system far larger than their intentions. And in those moments, he understood, reflection is never easy. Reflection demands courage, humility, and honesty. And it is in reflection that human change begins. The watcher's voice whispered in memory, the system can be exposed. Power can be measured. But the heart is always the unknown. He scribbled slowly, every moral choice is a ripple. Every act of awareness is a tremor. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving streets glistening with the residue of the storm. Neon lights shimmered in puddles like broken stars. The city was alive, indifferent, moving forward. Yet in quiet spaces, offices, apartments, cafes, the human mind wrestled with revelation. Questions formed. Decisions lingered. Conscience stirred. The dreamer realized that reflection isn't passive. It's active. It's not just thinking about what has happened, but feeling it, measuring it, allowing it to shape future choices. Reflection bridges the gap between knowing and acting, between understanding and courage, between exposure and transformation. He walked slowly through empty streets. The hum of distant traffic, the soft flicker of lights, the occasional drip from gutters, all became part of the rhythm of contemplation. Every human in the city was now, in some small way, participating in reflection, whether consciously or not. Awareness had been awakened, and reflection is its natural companion. He thought about fear. How easy it is to let fear dictate action, to retreat into convenience, to pretend that exposure never happened. And yet, he knew that courage is forged in reflection. In confronting fear, in assessing responsibility, in deciding to act with integrity even when the outcome is uncertain. The dreamer paused at a bridge, looking down at the river reflecting fractured light. He thought about the machine. About power. About control. About human imperfection. And he realized something vital: reflection cannot be controlled. Systems can manipulate perception. Institutions can suppress narrative. But human conscience, once stirred, moves independently. And it carries consequences, slow and inexorable, that power can rarely anticipate. He wrote again, systems bend. Machines turn. But human conscience moves freely, unstoppable, unpredictable, essential. Somewhere, in a distant office, a young aide stared at their screen, rereading last night's clips. Somewhere else, a parent explained fragments of what had happened to a child, carefully, selectively, truth mingled with caution. Somewhere else, a professor paused mid-lecture to incorporate the subtle lessons into discourse. Reflection, small and intimate, spread invisibly, threading through lives in ways no broadcast, no headline, no scandal could fully measure. The dreamer understood the paradox: consequences ripple outward, but reflection moves inward. And both are essential to the moral evolution of any human system. Without reflection, revelation is fleeting. Without consequence, reflection can remain abstract. Together, they seed understanding, and from understanding, change begins. He thought about himself. About the files he held. About the knowledge, the responsibility, the moral weight. The files were dangerous, yes, but they were also a catalyst. And it was his choice, as it is for anyone who witnesses truth, to act deliberately, thoughtfully, courageously. Reflection illuminated what action should follow. Without it, even exposure becomes performative, empty, ephemeral. He looked at the city again. Neon reflections in puddles, rain-streaked windows, streets pulsing with life. The storm had passed, externally. Internally, it continued, quietly. In offices, homes, and minds. Reflection was the quiet storm. It could not be ignored. And in it, he saw the potential for redemption, integrity, and courage. The watcher's memory returned, soft and deliberate: awareness without reflection is incomplete. Knowledge without conscience is dangerous. He nodded, whispering almost to himself, and reflection without action is wasteful. He thought about hope. Not naive hope. Not sentimental hope. Hope born of awareness, tempered by reflection, and grounded in moral courage. Hope that even in the midst of systemic complexity, human integrity can persist. That even when power seems invincible, conscience can influence outcomes. That even in darkness, choice endures. The dreamer closed his notebook. The files remained, silent, waiting. But he had seen enough. He had reflected enough. And now, the next steps, measured, deliberate, human, would emerge. He whispered to the city, sometimes, the quietest moments hold the loudest truths. And in that quiet, he felt the weight lift slightly, replaced by clarity. Not certainty. Not victory. Just understanding. A clear vision of the moral landscape, the human stakes, and the responsibility that awareness demands. He took a deep breath. And for the first time since the storm began, he allowed himself to imagine a future where awareness, consequence, and reflection could converge to shape something better. The city continued, indifferent yet alive. But for those who had witnessed, for those who had reflected, for those who had chosen to carry awareness, nothing would ever be the same. And in that subtle, quiet certainty, the dreamer understood the essence of human resilience, to see clearly, to reflect deeply, and to act courageously. In cafes, reporters debated the implications of what they had seen. Some feared reprisal. Some feared inaction. And yet, beneath their fear, there was a spark, the spark of responsibility. Witnessing truth, they realized, carries weight. And weight, once felt, can compel movement. The machine was still turning. Slowly, methodically, trying to maintain order. But the gears had been exposed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to fracture its seamless appearance. And fractures, once present, are paths through which change flows. The dreamer remembered the faces from the debate. Anchors, politicians, panelists, all caught in the tension between appearance and reality. Some would act with integrity. Some would exploit chaos. Some would hide and hope the storm passed. And that uncertainty, that human unpredictability, was both terrifying and beautiful. He walked past the Capitol, its marble cold and indifferent. The streets hummed with the rhythm of a city oblivious to the subtle seismic shifts beneath. And yet, those who had witnessed the storm knew the landscape had altered. The rules of perception had been tested, the illusions fractured, and the human element revealed. Somewhere, the watcher observed from a quiet cafe. She noted the patterns forming in real time. Tweets, posts, articles, the echo of last night's revelation spreading, shaping thought, altering conversation. She sipped her coffee and allowed herself a small smile. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but recognition. Awareness had been planted. Change, subtle but inevitable, would follow. The dreamer paused at a crosswalk, watching people move past. He realized the aftermath wasn't just in headlines or debates. It was in the subtle, human moments, the quiet acknowledgement that reality had shifted, even if only slightly. Conversations would be different. Decisions would be measured. Awareness had entered the bloodstream of the city. And once in the bloodstream, it is hard to remove. The files remained with him, heavy yet necessary. Not evidence for leverage. Not tools for power. But instruments of clarity. Instruments that illuminated the system, the people, and the moral architecture that underpins human decisions. And in that illumination, there was choice. Choice that would ripple, in small ways and large, through the city, the nation, and perhaps the world. He thought of the politicians trying to regain control. The machine attempting to restore order. The anchors and journalists recalibrating for the next broadcast. And he understood something crucial: none of it mattered in isolation. What mattered was human engagement, people recognizing, questioning, reflecting, and acting. Without that, even the clearest revelations are like leaves swept in the wind, beautiful but ephemeral. The dreamer found himself back at his apartment as evening approached. He spread the files across his desk once more. Not to obsess. Not to tremble at the weight. But to remind himself of the responsibility that awareness brings. Knowledge without action is incomplete. Understanding without courage is hollow. And he knew, even in the quiet, in the stillness, that action would come. Outside, the neon lights returned. The rain had softened to a drizzle, reflecting in puddles like scattered stars on asphalt. Washington's pulse resumed its familiar rhythm, but beneath it, something different beat. Awareness had entered the flow of life. Humanity had seen the machine's skeleton. And that knowledge, carried quietly in millions of hearts and minds, could never be erased. The city moved around him, unaware of the quiet reckoning happening in millions of hearts and minds. And that was the essence of hope, invisible yet real, subtle yet unstoppable, fragile yet persistent. Awareness, carried quietly, could reshape the future in ways that no headline, no scandal, no system could fully anticipate. He rose from the bench. The sun caught his face, warm and steady. A breeze moved across the river, carrying faint sounds of life, laughter, conversation, footsteps, a distant siren. Everything ordinary, yet imbued with the extraordinary weight of human choice. He whispered to himself, to the city, to the world. Truth survives only when it's carried forward. Choice defines its impact. And courage shapes what endures. The files lay behind him, the debate concluded, the machine still humming in quiet corridors. And yet, he felt a strange peace. Not triumph. Not victory. Not certainty. But the calm that comes from understanding, from reflection, from embracing responsibility. He thought about the future, uncertain, unpredictable, human. The storm had passed, but its echoes would persist. People would continue to act, to choose, to reflect. And through their actions, the subtle work of reshaping morality, integrity, and awareness would unfold. He walked back toward his apartment, notebook in hand, files carried with respect. The city, vast and indifferent, stretched endlessly around him. Yet within that vastness, human choice had been awakened. Awareness had been ignited. Reflection had been inspired. And somewhere, in the quiet, courage would follow. He stopped at the door, looking back one last time. The city hummed beneath him. The sun rose higher. The neon of yesterday's storm faded into morning clarity. And he whispered, softly, as if to a listener only he could hear. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. Because it does. Every revelation, every storm, every choice, every reflection, they are all threads in the tapestry of human consequence. Some threads are visible. Some invisible. But together, they shape the fabric of the future. The dreamer entered his apartment, closing the door. Outside, Washington continued. People walked, talked, lived. The machine still turned, plotting its calculations. But within hearts and minds, a subtle revolution had begun. Awareness, moral reckoning, reflection, courage, the quiet tools of human resilience, had been awakened. And in that awakening, the dreamer found resolution. Not in victory. Not in scandal. Not in control. But in truth, quiet, fragile, unstoppable truth.